Fascism didn't rise on fear alone. It rose on jobs, debt, and a promise that the state would fix everything. When people think of fascism, they picture armies marching and flags waving. But beneath the theatre, the real machinery wasn't military. It was economic. Dictators didn't just control the people with guns. They controlled them with payrolls. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide. This is the story of how fascist leaders discovered that the easiest way to buy obedience wasn't through terror, but through employment, and how an entire generation, desperate for security, sold its freedom for a paycheck. The stage was set by disaster. In the 1920s, Europe was exhausted. The Great War had drained treasuries, shattered industries, and destroyed currencies. In Germany, hyperinflation turned savings into wallpaper. In Italy, returning soldiers found no jobs, no pensions, and no purpose. Democracies were young, fragile, and broke. Then came 1929, the crash that finished what the war had started. Unemployment across Europe soared above 30%. In Berlin, people sold their furniture for food. In Rome, families stood in bread lines that stretched across plazas built for emperors. In the vacuum of this chaos, a new kind of politician emerged, not promising liberty, but order. Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco didn't rise because people wanted dictators. They rose because people wanted stability. Each man offered the same deal: surrender political freedom in exchange for economic security. They understood something democracies hadn't. When money fails, ideology becomes currency. When Hitler took power in 1933, Germany was on its knees. 6 million unemployed, industrial output halved. But within 3 years, unemployment had nearly vanished. To the outside world, genius. To the people it felt salvation. The Nazi regime was giving out jobs, building highways, the autobahns, factories, stadiums, and even a new affordable car, the Volkswagen. But behind the illusion was an economic sleight of hand so audacious it changed history. The Nazis didn't find money. They invented it. Through a system of secret promissory notes called Mefo Bills, they created billions in off-the-books credit IOUs disguised as industrial contracts. The state forced companies to accept these notes as payment, promising to redeem them later. Full employment without visible debt. Prosperity without proper accounting. The factories roared back to life. Workers cheered. But it wasn't productivity that fueled the recovery, it was militarization. The jobs miracle was simply a rearmament program wrapped in national pride. The genius was psychological. People didn't feel oppressed, they felt employed. They weren't coerced into loyalty. They were paid for it. And when your paycheck depends on the state, freedom becomes negotiable. Across the Alps, Mussolini was playing his own version of the same game. The Duce promised unity, a third way between capitalism and communism he called the corporate state. The regime replaced free trade unions with state-run syndicates. Wages and prices were fixed. Private companies technically remained private, but only as long as they obeyed. Every industry reported to the fascist party. Propaganda sold efficiency as virtue. Mussolini made the trains run on time. It became a global cliché, proof that fascism worked. But the numbers told another story. Productivity stagnated, debt ballooned. Mussolini's public works programs cost far more than the country could afford. Italy's miracle wasn't growth. It was branding. In Spain, Franco watched and learned. After a brutal civil war, his new regime promised economic autarky self-sufficiency. Spain sealed itself off from trade, nationalized industries, and rationed everything. To get a job, a loan, or even a house, you needed loyalty, not skill. The black market became the only real market. Famine followed, yet Franco stayed in power for nearly 4 decades. Why? Because the loyalty mechanism worked. People equated obedience with survival. The regime had turned scarcity itself into control. Different countries, different ideologies, but one shared formula: debt, jobs, propaganda, control. The fascist regimes didn't just rebuild their economies. They reprogrammed their citizens. They created a society where employment was loyalty, and dissent meant unemployment. Economic dependence became the soft weapon of dictatorship. By the end of the 1930s, the economic illusion had reached its peak. On the surface, fascism looked like a cure for capitalism's chaos, but it wasn't a cure, it was a conversion. The invisible hand of the market had been replaced by the iron fist of the state. The true genius of fascist economics was not efficiency, but control. Dictators learned that fear can only hold power for so long, but dependency can last forever. The worker who depends on the state doesn't revolt. He salutes for survival. The mechanics were simple. Jobs. Employment was made a moral duty. Work makes you free. The Nazi slogan, twisting labor into loyalty. Debt, public works, and military expansion gave the illusion of prosperity, financed by borrowed, printed, or hidden money. Propaganda. Every policy was dressed in the language of pride and destiny. Citizens saw themselves as participants in a grand national project. That's what made the control invisible. When you think you're building the future, you don't notice the chains on your hands. But here's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because the economics of control didn't die in 1945. They evolved. Modern governments learned the same lesson. You can buy stability with jobs and credit long before you ever need force. When unemployment rises, the solution is always the same. Massive public spending, stimulus packages, and patriotic branding. The message is familiar. Work is dignity. Buy local. Supports the nation. The relationship between governments and citizens today looks less like partnership and more like payroll. When your mortgage depends on interest rates, your savings depend on inflation, and your income depends on state-funded industries, how free are you really? You don't need censorship when compliance is profitable. Today, entire industries survive not because they are competitive, but because they are politically useful defense, energy, surveillance, infrastructure. When the state becomes the employer, the investor, and the regulator, the economy stops being a system. It becomes a hierarchy, and hierarchies reward obedience. The lesson of fascism's economics isn't just about history. It's about human behavior. People don't fall for tyranny because they love it. They fall for the illusion of safety. And when economies collapse, people will trade anything for stability. Fascism didn't sell ideology. It sold insurance, and the premium was freedom. The line between policy and propaganda disappears when the state becomes the economy. The final stage of fascist economics wasn't stability, it was expansion. When there was nothing left to borrow, the regimes borrowed lives. The warning is simple, but it never ages. When the promise of security becomes permanent policy, freedom becomes temporary. Every democracy that forgets how fascism funded itself risks repeating its methods, quietly, bureaucratically, debt by debt, paycheck by paycheck. Because economic control doesn't always march in uniform. Sometimes it arrives wearing a suit, smiling, promising growth and offering you a job. And by the time you realize what it cost, the freedom you traded is already gone. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers.